This recording is one of the series of recordings that is covering the endocrine system. This will specifically look at the role of the hypothalamus and its link with the endocrine system. So I'm going to start with is the hypothalamus, to me, and a lot of other people, that is the master endocrine organ. I wouldn't necessarily consider it a gland, but a lot of people, like in textbooks, you say, oh, the master endocrine gland is the pituitary. But the hypothalamus is, I'm going to try to convince you, is the master. Okay, so here's a sagittal section of the brain, and the hypothalamus is in this area right here. You'll notice where I'm going to color red, this is the infundibulum and of the brain. It's actually of the pituitary gland, and I'm going to color the pituitary gland in blue. So there's this link between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, but we're just going to focus here on the hypothalamus. You learned a lot about that when you did the nervous system, but it does play a major role in the endocrine system. So some of the things that hypothalamus does. So up here, this up here represents the hypothalamus. Here's the pituitary gland down here, okay? And so you can here's the anterior view, here's posterior view, okay? So the hypothalamus, one of the things it does is it's involved in production of tropic hormones, and we'll define that to you in a moment. So a tropic hormone is a hormone that acts on another endocrine gland to control the release of other hormones. Okay, so you can write that down. A tropic hormone. Here I will get to a blank screen and I'll write it down for you. Okay, so here I have it written down. So something that's referred to as a tropic hormone, that hormone acts on another endocrine gland and controls the release of other hormones. So it could stimulate the release or inhibit the release of other hormones. So one of the things that the hypothalamus does produce tropic hormones. Now, the hypothalamus is not the only organ that produces tropic hormones, so don't think it's just exclusive to the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is going to produce a number of different hormones that are going to be tropic. Now, if I say something is non-tropic, that means it directly targets a cell to induce some sort of effects. It's not stimulating or inhibiting the release of a hormone. Now, I will also, while I'm here, define to you the term trophic. If you have a hormone that's referred to as trophic with a pH, it has a growth effect on the tissue. And I'll give you two examples of hormones that are trophic hormones, and that would be TSH and ACTH. Now, these are not produced by the hypothalamus, though. Those are produced by the anterior pituitary gland. So you have tropic hormones, you have trophic hormones. So let's go back and look at the hypothalamus and some of the tropic hormones that it produces. So the tropic hormones that it produces, I'm going to put the production of tropic hormones here as number 1 right here. And so say these cell bodies of these neurons produce them. And if you kind of look very carefully, you see something coming down here, and right up in this area is your anterior pituitary gland. Now, how I know it's the anterior pituitary gland, if we won't back up here, here's the anterior view. Here is the optic chiasm. So the optic chiasm is always anterior. So here's the anterior pituitary gland. Well, the hormones, those tropic hormones produced by the hypothalamus, will come down, and we're going to talk about specifically very shortly how they get there. But they're going to regulate the secretion of a number of different hormones by the anterior pituitary. But actually what I'm going to do is I'm not going to write them down now because I'm going to write them down later when I talk about the anterior pituitary gland for the tropic hormones. But I'm going to, while I'm on the picture, I might as well list the hormones made by the anterior pituitary. So then we'll have to go back and look at those hormones that affect that by the hypothalamus. So here are some of the hormones secreted by the anterior pituitary, which are regulated by certain tropic hormones from the hypothalamus. Now, a second thing that the hypothalamus does is it produces two hormones, and I'm going to put this as number 2 right here. They say these cell bodies are involved in the production of ADH, antidiuretic hormone, and a hormone called oxytocin. Now, these hormones are produced in the hypothalamus, but they're going to travel down via axonal transport. So they're going to travel within the axons, come down here, and they're going to be stored in these synaptic knobs that are located right here within the posterior pituitary gland. And we will talk about that at a later time. So first we got produces some tropic hormones, and we're going to list them in a little bit. So we'll have a whole thing that we're going to list them off that regulate the secretion of certain hormones by the anterior pituitary. 2, it produces ADH and oxytocin, which are then stored in the posterior pituitary. Under the right stimulation, they'll be released into the bloodstream. The third thing it does is it controls sympathetic output to the adrenal medulla. So here is the adrenal medulla, which releases norepinephrine and epinephrine in response to sympathetic output. So the hypothalamus is very much involved in the autonomic nervous system, specifically the sympathetic nervous system. So the hypothalamus controls endocrine function quite a bit. It directly controls hormone secretion, and a lot of these other hormones that we're going to discuss will control other hormone secretions. It'll also regulate a lot of body processes. So that hypothalamus is a fairly important organ. It's a very strong link between the nervous system and the endocrine system. So let's kind of look at the pituitary gland. So, because you see there's that link between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. Well, the proper term for the pituitary gland is called the hypophysis. So if I say there has an animal or a person has been hypophysectomized, that's a term that means the pituitary gland has been removed from them. The pituitary gland is located within the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone. And there is this is actually lined by something called the diaphragma celli, which is it's composed up of dura mater. So this organ, which is about the size of maybe like your little nail and your little pinky, is such an important organ. It has to be kind of encased in bone to try to protect it. That connection up to the brain, you see, is right here. So we have the infundibulum. Okay, so I had mentioned the infundibulum. That's a word that you're going to hear a lot about. So infundibulum is a very non-specific term. So it kind of means funnel. And there's such a thing as an infundibulum in the fallopian tubes. There's infundibulum of your heart. Here's the infundibulum of the pituitary gland, if you can just, even if you want, say infundibulum of the brain. So this is this little stalk right here. That's going to play a little role here. Again, you'll notice here's the optic chiasm. So this right here is the anterior pituitary. Here is the posterior pituitary gland. I never would want you to just answer pituitary gland, because the pituitary gland is actually two distinct structures. The anterior pituitary gland is glandular. It looks like it is glandular epithelium. So under the microscope, it will look different. The posterior pituitary gland is actually nervous tissue. So you notice it says pars nervosa here. So I had mentioned previously those ADH and oxytocin, they actually travel down within the axons to the posterior pituitary, and that's what you're seeing. It's just the nervous tissue here. So those are actually two distinct structures. The proper term for the anterior pituitary is the adenohypophysis. Adeno having to do with glandular. So adenohypophysis is the anterior pituitary gland. Oop, then pipe. Spelled it wrong. There we go. The posterior pituitary gland is referred to as the neurohypophysis. So think neural. Okay, so we're going to look at the anterior pituitary gland first. So again, here, right there is the anterior pituitary gland. The anterior pituitary gland has a number of different types of cells that produce various hormones, and I have listed for them previously to you. Well, the hypothalamus, I had said, produces certain tropic hormones, and those tropic hormones are going to be released into a specialized capillary network referred to as the hypophyseal portal system. So hypophyseal portal system. So we're zooming in. Here's the synaptic knob of these neurons here, and those tropic hormones are released, and they're going to travel in a capillary network that serves these cells down here. So they call it the hypophyseal portal system. That term portal system you're going to hear about again. A portal system means that it's a capillary bed will pull into another capillary bed through veins without first going to the heart. Because typically blood will go from the arteries to the capillaries to the veins back to the heart. Well, here we're going from capillary bed to capillary bed without going going then to the veins without first going through the heart. So the reason why we have this system set up there, up in the brain, is we can have a relatively small quantities of those tropic hormones can be transported to the anterior pituitary in very concentrated forms, so they're not going to be diluted out in your systemic circulation. So the tropic hormones made by the hypothalamus travel by way of the hypophyseal portal system. They're then going to target the anterior pituitary gland and either stimulate or inhibit the secretion of a number of different hormones. And we're going to go through each one of them with you. So on this page right here, these are the names of those tropic hormones made by the hypothalamus. So make sure you remember that. Those hormones that I have listed on this page right now, I haven't drawn in yet, those are produced by the hypothalamus. These are all tropic hormones. I have the abbreviation for you here. It's appropriate to use these abbreviations, but I have the names of the hormones written out for you in your notes. Now you can feel free to write them out too if you want. So kind of breaking down the name, lots of times it can automatically tell you, does this hormone stimulate the secretion of another hormone, or does it inhibit? So where you see the R's, those stand for releasing. So thyrotropin releasing hormone is TRH. That tells you it stimulates the secretion of a hormone, specifically a hormone called TSH, which is made by the anterior pituitary. So all the hormones I list over here will be produced by the anterior pituitary gland. So TSH is thyroid stimulating hormone. The cells that produce that are called actually thyrotropes. So the specific cells that produce these hormones, they have a receptor for that tropic hormone that binds to it and then either inhibits or stimulates the secretion. So I'm going to jump down to the bottom where you see, or down here where you see the I's here. So you notice those stand for inhibitory. So they inhibit the secretion of a hormone. So we'll come back to those. So you have releasing hormones and you have inhibiting hormones. Now the second one is corticotropin releasing hormone, or CRH. That stimulates the secretion of ACTH by the anterior pituitary gland, which is short for adrenocorticotropin hormone. The cells that produce that are called corticotropes. GnRH is gonadotropin releasing hormone. It's important that the N is lowercase and not capitalized. So gonadotropin releasing hormone stimulates the secretion of two hormones that we refer to as gonadotropins. Now those two hormones are FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, and LH, which is luteinizing hormone. These two hormones target the gonads. So the gonads are like the testes in the male and the ovaries in the female. Now the next one is, it has a number of different names: prolactin inhibiting factor, or prolactin inhibiting hormone, because before they realized it was a hormone, they just identified it as some sort of factor, but they found, yes, it was a hormone, but it's also dopamine. So it's actually dopamine. So this prolactin inhibitory hormone, or inhibitory factor, inhibits the secretion of prolactin. GHRH is growth hormone releasing hormone that stimulates the secretion of growth hormone by the anterior pituitary gland. And the last one, growth hormone inhibiting hormone, also referred as somatostatin. I often use somatostatin other than GHIH. That inhibits the secretion of growth hormone. And we will be discussing growth hormone by itself in a recording. And we'll talk about FSH and LH when we do reproductive system. In a recording that covers the thyroid gland, we'll talk about TSH. ACTH we'll talk about when we do the adrenal cortex. And prolactin I'll talk about right now. It's pretty much the only time I'm going to talk about it. So look at this. So you'll see all of the hormones that I just listed, and just ignore these because we're going to come back to these later, so we're just going to ignore those, is the hormones that are produced by the anterior pituitary gland. You see here. And the one I did ignore, and I'm not going to apologize for it, is the anterior pituitary gland also produces a hormone called MSH, melanocyte stimulating hormone. Now that is not produced in a normal adult, so that's why I ignore it. It is produced in certain abnormal conditions, also during pregnancy. Women get that mask of pregnancy, they get pigmentation in their face, and that does target melanocytes in the skin. But I ignore that because I typically am going to talk about normal adults. But MSH is produced in the anterior pituitary. Now, the different hormones, we're going to talk about them in subsequent recordings, but I just want to show you kind of generically where they're going to target. So TSH targets the thyroid gland because it's thyroid stimulating hormone. So that's going to stimulate the secretion of thyroid hormones, but some other things too. ACTH targets specifically the adrenal cortex, and that's going to control secretion of a number of hormones, specifically though more cortisol. Then we've got FSH and LH. In the females, FSH stimulates the maturation of the ovarian follicle. In males, it stimulates the maturation of the sperm. So think of the follicle as the gamete. So FSH stimulates gametogenesis. So sperm in the male, the eggs in the female. LH in the females is going to be involved in ovulation of the egg. Also, we're going to look at it's important in the latter part of the menstrual cycle, important in something called the corpus luteum. In males, it stimulates the secretion of testosterone. So we have FSH and LH, which targets the gonads. Prolactin. Okay, prolactin, when it is released, it doesn't have the, if we say we don't have the inhibition by dopamine, prolactin targets specifically the mammary glands. and it stimulates the production of milk by the mammary glands. So that's going to be important in a female that has given birth and has chosen to breastfeed her baby. Now, growth hormone, we'll be talking about a little bit more in depth in the next recording, is growth hormone affects the growth and metabolism of most tissues in the body. And so we'll talk about kind of what you're seeing right here in a subsequent recording. And I just mentioned MSH previously. MSH is actually produced by this kind of like a center part right here called the pars intermedia, but its function in healthy adults is relatively unknown. Now, I have actually, in conjunction with, or I should say collaboration with a former student, we sat down and came up with a mnemonic for the hormones produced by the anterior pituitary, and I have it written for you in your notes. So we have it as all Texans love firearms, pistols, guns, munitions. So you see at the beginning of each one of those words gives you the beginning letter of a hormone. So all is ACTH, Texans is TSH, love luteinizing hormone, firearms FSH, pistols is prolactin, guns is growth hormone, and munitions is MSH. So we kind of came up with that together. So this is going to be the last of just an introduction to looking at the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus. Next recording, we're specifically going to look at growth hormone.